Hi everyone, thanks for joining. We're just going to wait for a few more participants to come into the room and then we will kick off. Good morning, everybody, and thanks for joining us today for our Fireside Chat on the most in-demand skills for 2021. I'm Alex Hattingh, and I head up People and Culture for Employment Hero. And today I'm absolutely thrilled to be joined by Dan Fish, who is the Director of Education at Go1. Dan is an innovative thought leader in the education and training space. He is really passionate about the industry and the important part it plays regarding our society. Following a really successful career in advertising, Dan worked for a number of NGOs in child welfare. He has since partnered with technology businesses with a particular leaning towards education and career-related outcomes. For those of you who have not had exposure to Go1, it's an absolutely fantastic platform that we use at Employment Hero with access to well over 50,000 courses. And we've found it absolutely terrific for our employees, especially as we moved to remote work. So thanks for joining us, Dan. Let's kick off with maybe a bit of an introduction of Go1 and what you guys do.
Thank you very much, Alex. And as always, an absolute pleasure to be here today, and really excited about the topic and to have an opportunity to talk more. So yeah, I mean, it's obviously a challenging time at the moment, and it's been a fascinating 2020, depending on which way you look at it. I think from our perspective, it's been interesting to see how not so much the thinking and the landscape has changed markedly, but more so how this has really accelerated time and sort of speed to market in a lot of instances. I think, and we're going to touch on it today. We were just talking a minute ago about how a lot of this stuff through COVID, etc., has spoken into sort of remote workforce, and the role that Go1 plays as a learning platform and provider to help and support that. But yeah, just really excited to be able to be here today and talk a little bit more about it.
Fantastic. Thanks, Dan. So the last time I saw you was before COVID, and we've had a wild ride of a year. So before I get started on asking Dan for his insights, if any of you have questions, please just throw them in the Q&A little box in Zoom, and at the end of the questions, we will get to those Q&A. And we're also recording today's session. It will be sent out afterwards. So I'd love to start with some statistics that come from the World Economic Forum Future of Jobs report, which states that 50% of employees will need reskilling by 2025. Would you agree with this?
I mean, I would actually argue that it would probably be more, but I guess it depends on the context and how we see lifelong learning. I mean, I think there's always room for the evolution of our skill set and opportunities to learn new skills. But I think 50% is probably about on the money. I think there's no question that the view of the workforce and what that workforce looks like, over the next 5 years will start to look differently as we see things like automation and other sort of critical components start to impact the skill set of the workforce. I mean, I'm sort of always drawn to some fantastic conversations I have with an organization called Fathom, who do a lot of work around forecasting the impact for countries and enterprise businesses on things like automation and the requirements of skills in the future. And the classic example that I talk through quite a lot, but it's hyper pertinent, is when we think about things like accounting. Automation and a certain volume of an accountant's role can and will be done by machines in the future. There's a lot of number crunching and work that is right in that sweet spot. So I think there's definite areas where we will see that need for upskilling. I think the key thing though there is that the upskilling component is part of the exciting thing. So again, using that accounting example, one of the pieces with that is that if this disruption is going to happen and the requirement and need for upskilling is there, how do we look at it? And there's platforms like Fathom and others, Seek and so on, that are able to start saying, well, look, you're an accountant now, you've got this specific skill set. Actually, if we start looking at other roles that exist out there, like cybersecurity, 60% of that skill set you already own and have. So it's just that 40% outside of that, which is really pertinent to the IP component of that cybersecurity thing. Great news is that can obviously be taught. So I think there's a huge volume of opportunity, and I think there's a lot of roles that we will see changing and requiring that upskilling by 2025.
Fantastic. And so what are you actually seeing on your own Go One platform? Where are people spending the most time upskilling right now?
Yeah, I mean, I'll probably talk through a few examples on this one. There's a really broad spectrum of learning and upskilling that is taking place. And I think, again, context is really key. We sort of have this view where we like to try and look at an individual's learning as lifelong, or an employee's learning as lifelong. So not just necessarily the 3-year period that they're with one particular organization, but something that's sort of setting them up for the rest of time. And so I think with that, there's a huge amount of skills and content that we see consumed. I'll go through a few examples because I think it starts to sort of paint that picture for us. We do a lot of work with the Singaporean government through their trade union over there. And I'm not sure whether people know, but there is allocation of funding for Singaporean people to be able to go out and do that training. And in particular, during COVID, there was a real push by the Singaporean government to look at supporting people during that transition, in particular around sort of digital skills. And I think in the space of around 60 days, we got close to 800,000 or 600,000 different learners running through that solution or accessing content. And fascinatingly, I think of the top 10 courses that were available, around 3 or 4 of them were Microsoft Office based. And this surprised us because I think there's a assumption that lots of people out there already know how to use Excel, already know how to use PowerPoint. And I think with that vulnerability that COVID brought, it sort of forced people to take stock and actually look at, okay, well, what is my base level skill set when it comes to the digital landscape, and what is it exactly that I need to know? So, in that specific example, I think, as I said, the number 1 course being consumed, or 2 of the top 3 were around Excel, which for us was quite interesting. I think when we think about the sort of other areas that we work in, maybe sort of thinking about teachers and again, thinking about that requirement for technological upskilling, what we saw during COVID in the last sort of 12 months was really compelling. And I'll touch on this a little bit later, but even my daughter's at high school, and seeing what her remote learning experience was like was quite telling, because it was, and again, through no fault necessarily of the schools itself, is that, they were really not prepared, both from a school perspective, but a teacher perspective, on how to deal with this new landscape that they were driven. So part of what we've seen as a fallout from that is a real focus on digital pathways and digital skilling for teachers, so that it's not just about the technological component, but the resilience component as well that comes with the challenge of having to learn from home. I think another piece that we've seen quite an uplift in is around HR itself, and how these teams and areas of the industry support employees, especially with a push to a more remote workforce. And so I think, again, that's something that we'll touch on a little bit more broadly today. But there's I think quite a few assumptions out there at the moment, and the dust is still yet to settle on what a really effective remote workforce looks like. Because I don't think it's just technological. It's not just having a laptop, access to Slack, etc. It's the cultural and humanistic components that come with working remotely. I think the other areas where tend to be more aligned to a lot of the reports and papers that are out there at the moment are those future skills piece. So specifically thinking about things like critical and design thinking and analysis, problem solving, as I said, with the accountancy example, those areas where automation and AI and ML is going to really struggle to outperform humans. These are critical skill sets that, we definitely urge everyone to look at, because it's very, very difficult, certainly in the short to mid-term, for a machine to be able to do a lot of that stuff. I think also and just linking it back to that remote workforce piece, another area that we're starting to see a real uptick in, and it was interesting to see the report that you referenced talking to this as well, is self-management. I think now more than ever, and especially after 2020, there's a real focus on people upskilling and training themselves from a self-management perspective. So, that might seem surprising, but, I think, again, with the context of the last 12 months and certain uncertainty of the future, it's probably becomes more obvious. And I think when we speak about self-management, we're thinking about things like flexibility, we're thinking about things like stress tolerance, active learning, resilience, all of these types of critical skills. And in an age where prior to 2020, so much of the noise was about sort of automation and the process of machines taking over, so to speak, these skills that are coming back to the forefront are incredibly humanistic ones. So
yeah, no, self-management is a fantastic one, and certainly I'm guilty of it. When I first started working remotely, I found myself at my desk from 7 a.m. and it was still winter at that stage, and before you knew it, it was dark and you weren't getting out of the house to get exercise. And yeah, part of that self-management is also making sure as leaders we give permission to our employees to take those breaks throughout the day and look after their physical and mental well-being. So moving on, it's no news to anyone that this year has led to the fastest digital transformation the world has ever seen. Technology acceleration is likely to continue, especially in the areas of cloud computing, data science, automation, and e-commerce. For a lot of non-technical people, the prospect of this is really daunting. So Dan, do you have any advice for those who are new to technology and really want to get started in these areas?
Yeah, I think first of all, it's really critical to be able to sort of assess and understand how technology and any other form of disruption for that matter has the capability of affecting your role, your company, your industry. And again, I think if 2020 taught us anything, it's the importance of not being complacent when it comes to this. So I think a first sort of pass on it is very much around understanding what technology looks like in your space, where your areas of interest are, what you're passionate about. I mean, obviously, if you're not passionate about technology at all, that's a separate problem, but there's certainly no question that there's going to be an element of technology in your role, whatever that looks like. I think the other component of it is to start simple. There's some really interesting pieces coming out at the moment at a government level, trying to reimagine how people access sort of point in time content and training, and a particular focus on the vet space, and reimagining what that looks like. I think one of the concerns for people coming in and trying to look at technology or upskill or educate more broadly is this ability to sort of have that bite-sized sort of initial experience to ease people in. And this is one of the conversations that we have time and time again when we're thinking about sort of the vet space, particularly because of that pathway into employment, is that it's still very traditionally based around this structured, rigid, accredited and award-based environment, as opposed to being able to consume content in areas and stack that learning up into some form of credential. Now, we're probably some way off from this, but I guess as far as advice to people that are looking to understand technology better, it's really just to start thinking about, you know, what podcasts are out there, what blog posts, what articles can I consume that I do anyway, and just sort of slightly pivoting or positioning your focus on stuff that you might have been looking at and thinking more about how, okay, well, if I'm interested in this space, what can I do? And certainly one of the big things from a Go On perspective is this ability to be able to encapsulate not just the formal component of learning, like short courses, you know, conferences, etc., but also all of the reading and informal stuff that we do, so like podcasts, blog posts, videos, etc., and start to be able to sort of pull those together for the learner and create some data assets around this. So I think really it's not allowing the technology educational component to overwhelm you, and just start to look at you know, some of the informal pieces before sort of venturing out and jumping straight into the heavier pieces. I think the other piece for me, though, is that there are so many fantastic resources that exist out there. And I think, you know, the ability now more so than ever to be able to start building this record of knowledge, and the ability to start using that as a foundational piece. And again, thinking about that concept of stacking up credentials and knowledge is really important. But there's a ton of platforms and technologies out there. And again, you know, one of the big things that we're looking at in the future is far more around that informal learning piece and how we can capture that data.
Fantastic. So moving on to the digitalisation of work, which will likely continue and expand outside of white-collar professions post-COVID. Back to that World Economic Forum report, it states that 84% of employees are set to rapidly digitalise working processes, including a significant expansion of remote work capabilities. Some looking at the potential to move a whopping 44% of their workforce to operate remotely. And when we did our own research here at Employment Hero, we had the response that 92% of employees would like to continue to work remotely, at least some of the time. So Dan, what skills do you think are needed for this remote first future?
Yeah, and this is actually a really good question, because I think the view of certain people at the beginning of this sort of push into a more sort of distributed and remote workforce more recently has been very much around sort of technology. And I think initially the idea is it seems simple, you know, we just need to make sure that people have got laptops, we need to make sure that people have got the right technology and software. But I think, again, as I sort of touched on earlier, there's some really critical cultural components that need to be addressed and explored when it comes to remote. Now, that being said, there's a number of different industries and role types that really thrive from a remote, when working remotely. But I think the assumption that everyone is of the opinion that, oh, it's great to work from home, it's far more flexibility, and you know, I get to make coffee when I want and whatever else. I think we've started to see some of the negative connotations. And I think even from our own perspective as a business, you know, our people have always had the opportunity to work from home, but what we found when they were forced to work from home full time, they really craved their peers, their colleagues, and the ability to get back into the office, at least for a few days a week. I think, you know, there's some key questions that you need to have some clear answers to before executing on that remote strategy. And these are going to sound really obvious, but, you know, the first one for me is why. And again, it does sound stupid, but, you know, what are the key reasons for you know, sort of pursuing and promoting this remote work strategy? So I think that's something that we sometimes overlook, and I think there's definitely a bit of a whirlwind at the moment that people are getting caught up in, that it's just the thing to do because everyone else is, and also because we've been in this situation where we have been in lockdown. I think the other side of that is to also consider, though, what the perspective is of your people. I know, and I've spoken to a lot of different employees within different organizations where they've been forced to go back to work, even though they've just had this period of time where they've successfully been working from home, productive and everything else. So I think there's actually a critical component here where it's probably actually less about the employees and more about the business itself, possibly not having the trust in their people to be able to perform when at home. And that in itself is a whole different issue that probably needs to be explored. But I think companies need to be very cognizant now of the fact that the idea of remote working not being possible is a bit of a fallacy, unless of course there's certain industries where it just can't be done in that way. But even then it's a question of figuring out, okay, well, what are the flexibility options? How can we actually spend a bit of time investing in exploring this? I think another question is how. So you know, to my point a second ago, remote work isn't just simply sending people home with a laptop, a monitor, and an ergonomic chair. You know, there's far more to it that we need to think about. And I think, again, COVID's helped us with this in regards to sort of lifting the lid on, you know, okay, well, what are the culturally important things that we need to look at and be cognizant of? One of the other questions, again, is who. So realistically, we need to be able to look at the organization and say, okay, how much of my business can actually, you know, effectively work from home? There's obviously going to be some that can, but thinking about the impact for those that can't and what the opportunities are when it comes to thinking about that more, you know, sort of remote strategy piece. So they're three kind of questions that I'd urge people to think about. And in line with the point I made earlier, I'm actually less worried about the technological component of the remote strategy and more about the sort of humanistic ones. And I know that, again, that the World Economic Forum's report talked a little bit to this, but, you know, things like people's well-being, it's very difficult to manage that well-being remotely and relying on people to be honest and upfront about how they're feeling over an email, over Zoom, over Slack, etc. You know, nothing beats those sort of water cooler moments where you just bump into someone in the kitchen making a sandwich, or, you know, in a meeting, on your way out of a meeting room, and you just have that opportunity to ask questions, to tell people how you feel. I mean, I remember when we first went back, the first day when we were sort of drip feeding people back in, there was 3 of us in the office. I mean, it wasn't great for productivity on that day, but we must have spent about 2.5 hours talking, not necessarily just about the personal stuff, but just being able to bounce questions. And the look of excitement and the energy itself in the room was really compelling. And I think one of the big things for me that, you know, one of the dangers when working remotely is that physical energy. I don't know about anyone else, but, you know, there were days, and there are days, where you're doing 6 or 7 Zoom meetings, and, you know, you stack those 5 on top of each other. And by the end of the week, I found myself more exhausted than I was at the beginning. And so I think, you know, what I realized is that I sort of really crave that energy from people when I'm talking. Obviously, I'm quite passionate about what I do. And, you know, when you're having these conversations, if it's all about that giving and you're not able to just pick up on that physical energy, it's pretty draining. So I think, you know, that those abilities to be fairly spontaneous and those sort of water cooler moments are really critical. I think, you know, I'd be, and maybe it's something that the audience can chuck into the chat, but I'm really keen to hear how companies out there are addressing this sort of technological versus humanistic component, because I think I'm not, you know, there are a lot of things that we're trying to do, but even from a Go One perspective, I don't think we necessarily have all the answers. And again, I think we're going through this period at the moment where you know, we're sort of finding some of that stuff out ourselves. I think the last bit on this one for me, and again, it's sort of a more personal story, but I remember seeing my daughter go through, she just started high school and being remote schooled, and seeing how difficult that was for them to be able to get engaged, and subsequently actually chatting to the deputy head recently about how, you know, that entire year 7 group have really struggled to connect to the school because they've had this incredible disruption was really telling for me. And even from a teaching perspective, and this sort of links back to some of the upskilling question earlier, seeing how difficult it was and how ill prepared I think a lot of industries was quite confronting. And so I think, again, one of the things that, I'd urge people to consider is, and I'm sure given the year that has been, people are looking at this, but just to really think about how we can sort of be flexible and not rush too quickly into this remote first strategy, and really give it some time, because I think there are some fantastic components that it can bring, but there's also quite a bit of concern I have in particular around sort of people's well-being and their ability to continue to communicate and feel supported.
Absolutely. And to your point, I don't think, Dan, that anyone has all the answers and we're all learning as we go. We certainly found, in terms of looking after our people, putting a cadence in place for, daily huddles to make sure we had that human connection, and making sure there was a stringent process for one-on-ones between managers and employees with a shared template, so that they were connecting once a week. And that's also a really good way to talk about career development and what kind of skills people are feeling they're missing in this remote world of work, and how can we find a solution through Go One, for example, to try and meet that skill. And also, learning on the job and coaching. So through those one-on-ones, and also encouraging people that one-on-one doesn't always have to be on video. You can say, look, let's jump on the phone for this one-on-one this week, and why don't each of us go for a walk in our respective areas. At Employment Hero, when we had that 92% of people saying that they wanted to work remotely at least some of the time, we actually adopted a remote first policy across the organization, where it was completely up to you when you would go into the office. I was in there yesterday, and I absolutely felt the excitement that you talk about when you see colleagues in person for the first time in a little while. It can be, productivity can go down a bit because you are having those conversations, but it's really nice to have that human connection. So if we
Yeah, I
bring it
agree.
a little bit closer to home, what skills should Australian small to medium businesses be looking at in future hires, or even in terms of building capability for their existing teams?
Yeah, this is another good question. Again, I was reading through the Future of Jobs report that you referenced earlier, and whilst there was a lot of data that made sense, I was there was a section of it that I found really interesting, and it was more around the sort of significant uplifts in the amount of learning people are doing. Now, that in isolation is not surprising. However, the interesting piece was when we looked at those people who were learning while employed and those who were learning when unemployed. And so, just in context of the question, I think, thinking about this is important, because those people that you're bringing in that may have been unemployed or have been employed are looking at a couple of different things. So on the employed side, placing the report sort of talked about people placing a much larger emphasis on personal development courses and learning and education, and within that, the report references that there's been an 88% growth, which kind of makes sense to me, given that people are looking at from within the confines of being employed. There's those traditional areas that I think organizations tend to point towards. So thinking about your communication skills, your conflict resolution, all of these sort of traditional components that come with relatively traditional organizational L&D. The interesting thing, though, on the unemployed side was that there was a much greater emphasis placed on learning digital skills, so data analysis, information technology, computer science. So I've still been sort of working through why this isn't and how this is sort of relevant for the SME side. But I think from my perspective, it's important context, because I think, I've already mentioned a whole heap of skills around self-management and the sort of future skills stuff, which is really, really critical, that design thinking, analysis, etc. And again, on that self-management side, resilience, and so on. So, they are absolutely critical, I think, and especially in that SME space, to be mindful of and to be able to have as part of that onboarding experience. But I think layering in this other component that I've been talking about, sort of employed, unemployed, is is a critical one, because part of me, especially on the unemployed side, where it feels like the people that are finding themselves unemployed are taking the opportunity to go, you know what, I'm not going to look at the traditional personal development courses that come as part of that traditional piece. I'm actually going to take myself outside of that because I can, and I'm actually going to genuinely look at where my gaps are. And the interesting thing, and there's been a number of reports that have supported this as well, is that I think the view, especially in developing or developed countries, first world countries, is that, you know, there isn't as much of a digital divide or an issue around digital literacy, when in fact, you know, there really is. And I think it more so with the next generation coming through, there's a massive sort of hypothesis that, oh, you know, they know how to use their, look at them on their phones, they know how to do this, they know how to do that. If you were to put, you know, build me a pivot table in front of some of these kids, even the ones graduating high school, like, you know, it would be interesting to see whether they can do it. So there's some fundamentals, I think, and some assumptions that we make as business leaders, as managers, etc., when we're looking for these hires, that I think we assume that they'll be able to know this, that, and the other. And I think obviously part of that is sometimes part of the filter process. But I guess what I'm saying is that insight from the report that showed about employed people focusing more on professional development, unemployed focusing more on the digital skills piece, was really interesting. And I think that it's worth digging in for hiring managers to sort of really take the opportunity to understand that landscape better, and actually what it is that they're requiring from those people coming on board.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And what are you seeing in terms of the industries and the jobs that are experiencing the shortest skill supply?
So yeah, I mean, there's a few. I think there's no secret, you know, that we're going to experience a fairly considerable skill supply shortage in areas like technology, media, and telcos moving forward. I think part of this has a lot to do, again, to my point earlier about the inability to meaningfully address the digital skills gap that currently exists. And I'm just going to sort of take it macro for a second, because I think one of the big concerns and areas that I personally have is a more systemic one. So when we think about, and certainly not something that can be fixed overnight. So when I think about, and one of the areas that we at Go want to start to broaden out and look at now is that broader education piece. So thinking about K to 12, vet, higher ed, and what are the opportunities there for us as far as helping to take that same perspective of wanting to create more effective and efficient learning and apply it to some of this more institutional system. I think, you know, the issue that we've got there is that we're still very fenced in and hamstrung with regards to how quickly we can run. And so I think, you know, the ability for those institutions, again, whether it's sort of a high school, whether it's a TAFE, whether it's a university, is really difficult. And I'm not just blaming the curriculum per se, but I think there needs to be a better way of working that space in order to create really digitally savvy workers. And again, to my point earlier, you know, there's been a lot of conversation recently about this reimagination of skills of the vet space as an example. And I think, you know, the ability for people to effectively scale, not just in the digital space, but really in any short skill supplier industry, means that we need to be looking at sort of point in time, right content, right time in flow type learning experiences that are going to really help these types of industries. And so, you know, there was a great example recently, especially around the sort of technological sort of skills shortfall, where you had Google announcing they were pushing out a career certificate. And what they said was, for this Google career certificate, instead of recognizing a 3 or 4 year degree for a dozen roles that existed in the US, they would recognize this 3 to 6 month certificate over those for those specific dozen roles. Now, that's really telling because, you know, obviously not only is it telling in regards to the sort of short supply from a skills perspective, but it's also telling because, you know, you've got this big technology company saying the current system's not working. And I think you can actually sort of use the same analogy for technology as you can for a couple of other key skill short areas, whether it's agriculture, construction, and so on. And they basically said, look, we literally don't have the people, we don't have the time, the institutional component of the system is not able to keep up, unfortunately. So we've got no real choice but to go out and create our own certificate that will take 3 to 6 months and that will recognise over those more traditional sort of 3 to 4 year degrees. So I think kind of answers your question, but there's probably a few key industries in there, as I said, agriculture, construction, technology, where we're going to see some real skills shortage. And beyond just the shortage itself, that the things that I'm nervous and thinking about, and I think actually corporate organizations have an exciting part to play in this, and even us as employers have an exciting part to play in this, is to sort of be mindful of that, and rather than just focusing on the sort of traditional maybe professional development, how can we help those employees that are with us, because for their next jobs, and taking more of a sort of lifelong view of that. So
yeah, no, that's some great examples, but all of this can be overwhelming. We've talked about remote work. We've talked about the need to provide flexibility. You've also touched on, the need to be really humanistic as we approach remote work and learning and development. So what tips do you have for HR or leaders on the webinar who would like to get started with learning and development?
I'm always nervous about doing this because it's there's so many. I mean, look, there's one piece at the moment that there's a few things to consider, I guess. I think one, that the window for working with employees has been shrinking over the years, and by that I mean that the average tenure for an employee is down to almost about 3 years now. I mean, back in the day, it was a job for life and people would be with you forever. But the reality is it's around that 3 year mark. So, with this in mind, it's really important, and literally to the point I made a moment ago, to start taking that broader lifelong view of people's learning, not just from an engagement perspective, because I think if you think about the sort of more traditional approach on the HR and L&D side, it's okay, what are the business goals and objectives we have, and where are the gaps, and what do we need to service in order to plug those gaps. And that is absolutely critical and needs to continue to happen. But one of the things that I'd urge is for organizations and HR teams and L&D departments to think more broadly about the entirety of their people's sort of learning journey. And that becomes really important, because I think not only do you get better engagement and you start to harbor this real culture of ongoing learning, but you get these great advocates when they do eventually leave and go on to that next thing that they were looking to do anyway. So there's that piece there about, and that classic sort of adage of, oh, but what if we train them up and they leave? And it's like, well, what if you don't and they stay? And, what's the impact on business then? I mean, for us, it's just very much about trying to create this really habitual learning culture. And again, whether that's sort of the formal short course piece, or whether it's sharing articles or different blogs that you follow, etc. So I think that's the first piece. I think keeping it simple and spending some time thinking how technology can support and help in this learning process. There's a lot of great, really simple, effective ways to be able to deliver this. One of the things that we try and pride ourselves on, and one of the mantras we've got at Go One, is that you shouldn't have to learn how to learn. And really, one of the things that we try and do is work with existing tech stacks and existing providers that are out there to be able to more so sort of stitch it all together in this really nice ecosystem format, where you're able to access that specific type of content from provider A, or this other piece from provider B. And if you have your own learning management system already, or you use Employment Hero, being able to surface it within that ecosystem. So I think, back to this whole theme of digital skills, I think it's important that these HR teams and leaders are actually have a really good savvy view of this space as well, because there's some fantastic technology that works really collaboratively together out there. It's definitely worth investing in that. And for me, and shameless plug, but I think the work that Employment Hero and Go One have been doing to address this is a classic example where we can plug in that learning solution into Employment Hero's fantastic solution. I think given the points we've already touched on, and particularly supporting remote learning, I think empowering our people is a really critical one. So enabling them, again, as I said earlier, we've got the organizational goals and objectives that we need to be really clear on. And, there will be themes that we need to focus on as a business, but actually giving some of that power back to the individual to push their own learning journey. And I think, like with anything, when we as humans feel empowered, we tend to be a lot more engaged and bought in. So ensuring that whether it's in the one-on-ones or whether it's in a less regular catch-up, that you're able to set up this situation where they're able to come to you with specific learning needs and requirements, and that we should be comfortable that it's not always going to be 100% linked to the job that I do. I mean, the classic example for me is around data at the moment. I'm I love data, but I'm not a mathematician. I have no background in that. But the last couple of years have been spent doing a lot of informal and more recently formal learning around data science, artificial intelligence and machine learning, and more so just to understand facts that exist out there. I mean, I did a great course through UTS recently around data, and it was more to help you understand how ill-informed we are. And this particular one was on the extractive industry, and it was asking you a series of questions at the very beginning. What do you think about this particular topic, and who do you think are the major contributors? And at the end of the course, you realize that actually what you were thinking and what you thought you knew was totally wrong. So, but that's not my particular role, but actually having access to some of that material and that opportunity and experience has helped enrich and broaden my understanding, not just from the specific role that I do, but, again, going back to some of those key skills that we talked about earlier from a self-management perspective, which is assessing and understanding the world in front of you. So, yeah.
Yeah, I love it. And I love your point about keeping it simple. I think sometimes we overthink it and we think we don't have the budget. So how on earth do you meet L&D? Going back again to the one-on-ones and the coaching, and how can you reinforce skills and learning through on-the-job learning? And one of the things we found really effective with Go One and our sales team has been to look where someone wants to learn a soft skill, for example. They'll go and do a Go One course or a podcast if you don't have Go One or something, and then they'll actually come back and read out their learnings to the entire sales team. So you're then creating, what Dan referenced, which is that continuous learning cycle of curiosity and people wanting to learn. And then you get other people in the sales team kind of going, oh, wow, Claire just learned this. So next week I'm going to put my hand up and learn something and then read out and to the rest of the sales team on what I've learned. So yeah, not overthinking it, I think, is really important.
And I think
So,
the other,
yeah.
just to add on to that, and this is a really important one, and it has been a trap that the industry has fallen into for many, many years. I think one of the things that I love about what we do is that, again, it's to that empowerment piece and giving people options, right? Again, we're an aggregator of content, and but not to sort of disintermediate those providers, more so to put them in front of more people. And the critical piece is, like, if we think about how people have been consuming medium outside of the workplace and Netflix, Spotify, etc. Choice is really important. The great thing with Spotify is if I'm going to the gym, I want to listen to a certain type of music. If I'm having a coffee on a Sunday morning, I want to listen to a different type of music. The choice, the flexibility and diversity of what Spotify offers me is great. Learning is even more subjective, because you have an added layer of how people learn. You've got your genres, you've got your topics, you've got your areas of interest, but you've also got your, do I like to read? Do I like to listen? Do I like to watch? Do I like to talk to someone when I'm learning? And that subjectivity is critically important, because I think part of the problem we've all fallen in, the trap we've all fallen in, is like, we'll go with 3 or 4, 6, 7 different providers. And the reality is, if you're a small, medium, large organization, everyone likes to learn differently. Like, there is no one solution. So going back to that empowerment thing, giving people the choice to be able to curate their own pathway is another massive way. And I love that idea, Alex, of being able to sort of bring back and share, because another major component and that makes learning super powerful is that peer-to-peer piece. So I think that's a great idea.
Yeah, absolutely. And going back to empowering people, it's really important, especially in this remote world that we're in right now, is to give your people permission to learn on the job. So giving them permission to throw that time in their calendar and turn off Slack, turn off email, and actually fully concentrate, whether it's a video, a podcast, whether it's learning on the job, whatever it might be. Giving them the permission to actually do it on the job, again, creates that continuous learning kind of within your organization, and really fosters that culture, which is always good. So finally, I'd love to talk about what we call a skills gap analysis. For those new to this, it's a tool used to assess the difference or gap between the actual state and the future goal or state. So for HR, we might use a skills gap analysis to find out which skills and knowledge are lacking among employees in an organisation, or any leader for that fact. If you're working with your team during a coaching session or a one-on-one, you might want to use a skills gap analysis to kind of figure out where are the gaps in terms of where someone wants to go for their career, and how are you going to try and help fulfill those gaps. So Dan, would you recommend undertaking a skills gap analysis going into 2021, and where do people start?
Yeah, I think it's a given everything that's going on, I think it's absolutely pertinent. But I'm going to preface what I'm about to say with something in that I genuinely believe that in the future, not too distant future, this concept of being able to identify skill gaps is going to be much more in the flow of work and what we do normally. And I'll break that down a little bit. But ultimately, the answer is yes. I think, utilizing the time as we go in, and given what's been going on in 2020, there is a really, important time to be able to carry this out. But just to go back to my previous point, I think, again, in the context of learning, and when Go One looks at this, it's a lifelong thing, right? And the way that we can power this, and the critical component to being able to power a meaningful learning tool that goes with you lifelong, is data. And so those data assets are critically important when it comes to us being able to provide better search and recommendation functionality to our learners, regardless of what the content is. I think that's really important. And I think there's a lot of HR management systems, HRIS, learning, etc. platforms out there that are already capturing a lot of this data. So, my view is that is to sort of urge the audience and people to start thinking of other more agile ways that they're able to access and understand this same information that these skill gaps analysis push out, because inevitably and highly likely we probably already are capturing it. We just don't know how to surface it and manipulate it. And there are tools and technologies out there now that are able to start to pick this apart. And for me, if I think about Go One, and I think about the push into this concept of a learner profile, and that we believe there's a fantastic opportunity for us to play that role, if we're able to capture that in collaboration with other bits of technology that's capturing information, whether it's the job seeker profile or whatever else it is, you as an organization can start to look at some of this stuff in real time, either physically look at it or run systems over it to be able to very quickly look at that data, marry it up with performance data, performance to target, anything like that they have within the organization, and start to marry it all together to be able to start identifying those gaps in real time, and sew that into an ongoing sort of development plan that you have set up already. So I think the need for skills gap analysis is really critical in understanding, the health to a degree of the organization. But I guess what I'm saying is that in the future, and what I would really urge HR leaders to think about is, well, how can we do this in a more meaningful way that enables us to set up a cadence, or set up a system that actually monitors and manages that in real time. So it's not necessarily this thing that we do once every 6 months, once every 12 months. It's actually part of the DNA of the organization. So I think, long-winded answer, but yes, I think it is important. But I think going into next year, given all the disruption that we've experienced, it's probably worth investing some time in, okay, well, how do we actually start to do, rather than having these skill gaps analysis, maybe relatively less infrequently, how can we set this up so that it's actually part of the ongoing reporting of our people that we do? So.
Fantastic, thanks. So moving on to some Q&A that we've had come through. What is Employment Hero and Go One doing in terms of remote work, on-site working, once everything goes back to normal? So I'll kick off first, and then I'll let Dan jump in. So as I mentioned, we've adopted a remote first policy. One of the really great things that has done is opened up our pool of talent. So we really were limited to Sydney before, and now we've been hiring all across Australia. It also opens up a ton of employment opportunities for disabled people who might not be able to get into the office. We've also seen people relocate outside of Sydney, so they've moved closer to their family. For example, we had one employee sell their apartment in Potts Point and move 3 hours south to be closer to family, and they just come in as needed, as desired. For example, our sales team love seeing each other, so they're coming in every Wednesday at the moment and spending that time together. And then we get other people, more introverted people on the product and engineering side of the business, who are just lapping up working from home. So they only come in for what might be a quarterly offsite, or once COVID is gone and we are back to travel restrictions lifted, we'll have a whole of company gathering somewhere fabulous like Thailand or Vietnam, and that would be a 3-day conference where we'll do strategy and socially connect. So we're looking at our workplaces now as more of a hub to socially connect, and then you get your work done when you want. So you might just come in for the morning and then skip the commute, leave early and go and attend your daughter's soccer practice, for example. So that's what we're doing.
Yeah, and I really like that sort of hub analogy. I think, for too long, we probably, there's been question marks around productivity and performance and people's happiness by forcing people to come in. I think with the reset that we've experienced, that really has helped shine a light on the fact that these things are possible. I think from our perspective, that's exactly right. It's choice for the individual. I mean, we absolutely are leaving it with our team to be able to come in as and when they feel works best for them, if they've got families, if they want to go for a surf in the morning, whatever it might be. But again, what's been lovely to see through this time is the real desire for people to come back and want to connect. Now, that being said, if there was cultural problems prior, then it's something that you can maybe look to use this opportunity of at the moment to be able to address some of that and think about how bringing people back and connecting them is a way to work through it. But I think from our perspective, it's exactly the same. It's giving people the choice. It's using the office space more as a hub to be able to come in to do some collaborative work, go home, whatever it needs to be. And again, making sure the critical part for us is making sure that we're finding time to bring those people together, because I think even if it's at an event every couple of weeks, actually having people together in the office, having a lunch is really important.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. So the next question, in trying to be flexible, how do you manage the equality aspect when some employees choose fully remote work and others choose a mix of in-office and remote work? What tips would you give in such a scenario? So for us, we base everything on output and trust. So empower your employees to be trusted, and we use objectives and key results to kind of obtain that, as well as that cadence that I mentioned earlier. So making sure you're having daily huddles as teams, and that the entire company knows that every single team is held to the same equal expectations that everyone else is. And we've found it's worked really well. Our employee happiness scores have increased, as has our productivity.
Yeah, and I don't think for us, I don't think too much has changed as far as that piece. I absolutely agree, Alex. I think as long as you're doing your work and doing a great job and performing, it shouldn't really matter where and well, how you're doing it to a degree, but where that's happening. So I think it should be through OKRs and so on. It should be fairly straightforward to be able to manage that output piece. And obviously, if someone's working from home 100% of the time and isn't performing, then there's some questions that can be had around that. But it's really no more complicated than that. And I think that, again, for us, that hasn't really changed from when people were in the office. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I think it's worth noting that 92% of people that are going to be wanting to work remotely going forward, if you don't adopt this, I think that you'll lose talent. You'll see talent go to a company that's going to adopt remote work. So final question is for you, Dan. What are your thoughts on doing a Go One course as opposed to a university or a TAFE course? There's a lot of people doing formal training, but I want to know if I should be prioritizing those who don't have the qualifications but actually go out and actively complete either online courses or going to university or TAFE?
This question could be a webinar in itself, but the reality, the way that I see the world, and I'll try and answer this as quickly as possible, but the way that I see it is the future is a series of stackable learning experiences or credentials that end up with some form of assessment. And it shouldn't really matter where you learn. It shouldn't really matter what you learn. Because ultimately, and this has been the sort of the walled garden problem that the institutional education has experienced, is that it doesn't matter what you know or have learned before. I mean, we do have recognized prior learning now, which is great, but for me, it's just it's not even whether it's Go One or uni. It's the ability to be able to build up that knowledge and over time, and actually be able to showcase that in a stackable format. And there are already ways of doing that. You know, through our technology, we can do that. I think it's more so that the traditional award or accredited model doesn't allow much flexibility when it comes to being able to pick up lots of different pieces and patch it together over time. And the other issue for me is absolutely around that time piece. You know, more when we talk about the reimagination of vet or higher ed, I think there's still a piece missing here where we're still expecting people to pay thousands of dollars and spend 6 months of their time doing this course, as opposed to trying to be more flexible and enable that individual to fit it in during times that work for them. Now, it might mean that some completion becomes a problem or it ends up taking longer, but at least it's more so on their in their time frame and empowers them to sort of carry it out. So appreciate it's not the exact answer of Go One or this, but I think it's more so just sort of looking at the landscape and figuring out what set of learning works for you, and then bundling it together.
Yeah, no, great answer. And Go One actually has accredited courses. Prince 2 is a really good example around project management, and we invested in that for our project managers this year, and they not only enormously learnt a lot in terms of their own skill sets, but they walked away with something that they felt was tangible, that we'd invested in them because they got that Prince 2 accreditation. Well, I think that leaves us flat out of time, Dan. Thank you everyone for attending. Dan, if people want to know more about Go One, what's the email that they should?
They can hit me up, dfish@goone.com. We have just not long ago gone through a whole brand refresh, so please do feel free to come to goone.com, the new website, or yeah, hit me up over LinkedIn. But yeah.
Awesome. It's been great, Dan, and so good to see you again. So thank you everyone for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at the next webinar, and have a fabulous Christmas and a new year. See you, everyone. Bye.
Cheers.